right, so I guess we don't have Ms. Sadia Bitul because of internet and technical issues. Mr. Rustam Seerat, may you go ahead with the panel discussion, first panel discussion. The mic is over to you.
Thank you, Reza Ehsan. So for our first panel discussion, we have diverse experts on the issue. So the thing is, we will give them a chance for 10 minutes or 11 minutes to mention their, to talk about the issue of Hazara genocide from their own expertise and experiences and backgrounds. But at the meantime, we propose one question to each of our panelists. We have with us distinguished panelists. We have with us Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi. Dr. Ibrahimi is a senior lecturer of international relations at the La Trobe University in Australia. Dr. Ibrahimi specializes in Middle East politics, political violence, peace building, ethnic politics, and human rights. He is the author of the book, a very influential book, The Hazaras and the Afghan State, Rebellion, Exclusion, and the Struggle for Recognition. He is also the co-author of Afghanistan Politics and Economics in a Globalizing State with Professor William Melly. We have with us our second panelist, Dr. Abbas Farasoo. Dr. Abbas Farasoo is a researcher at La Trobe University. Dr. Farasoo has more than 15 years of experiences in academic, as well he has been a practitioner. He has worked with the Afghanistan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Also, he has worked with Afghanistan Mission to Australia. He has written on international security, contentious politics, and diplomacy. Dr. Farasoo has taught at the University of Melbourne, Deakin University, and La Trobe University. His subjects have been focused on Australian politics, diplomacy, and criminology. The third panelist is Dr. Farkhondeh Akbari. Dr. Farkhondeh Akbari is a postdoctoral researcher fellow at the Monash University, again in Australia. Dr. Akbari has written and conducted research extensively on topics such as peace process, non-state armed actors, feminist foreign policy, and women, gender, peace and security issues. Dr. Farkhondeh Akbari has published quite significantly on post-2021 regarding the Taliban gender apartheid in Afghanistan. She has obtained her PhD from Cornell Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs, Australian National University. Our fourth panelist, we have with us Bismellah Alizada, PhD candidate at SOAS University of London. Bismellah Alizada's PhD research centers on the demands for decentralization among the Hazaras of Afghanistan from 1992 to 2021. He has a wide interest in different issues, including political settlements, ethnic politics, and post-conflict institutional designs. He has obtained his MA from SOAS, and he has done his PhD in political science from the University of Kabul. So now we will start. This is our panelists, which we are very grateful for participating and joining us. We have with us all of our panelists. So I will start. We will start with Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi, and Dr. Ibrahimi can speak from his own expertise and whatever he finds it relevant to the issue of Hazara genocide. But we have one question to him, and the question is how the Afghan state historically has attempted to deal with the genocide of the Hazaras, if they had any policy of redressing or responding to it, and what have been overall what have been the role of the state. I know, Dr. Ibrahimi, you are the subtitle of your book is exclusion. So, but yeah, please, the mic is yours. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Seerat. Do we have about, in terms of time, we have about 10 minutes? How long do we speak?
Yeah, the initial plan was 10 to 11 minutes, but I think we could extend it to 13 or 14 because some of our presenters did not show up, so we could, and okay. It depends on the organizers. Please correct me if I'm not the organizers, please. Yeah.
You have 1 hour time. Maybe I mean all the panelists can talk 1 hour or 70 minutes, so it's fine, I think.
Okay, just reminder that we have a Q&A at the end also. So please type your questions at the bar, and then I will read that questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Seerat. Thank you, all organizers and everyone who is participating online. It is really an honor for me to be part of this really rich conversation about this really important topic, which is historical, but also, as we have discussed so far in the previous papers, also quite a contemporary issue, because the threat of genocide continues to remain quite significant in Afghanistan with regards to the Hazaras. So maybe I would like to begin by reflecting on the central question you raised, Mr. Seerat, on the role of the state and whether the state in Afghanistan has historically been making any effort to correct the wrongs that were committed towards the Hazaras, acknowledge or try to improve the situation of the Hazaras as a result of the genocide. I think to consider that question, it is important to consider that historically, genocide and other mass atrocity crimes often take place during periods of state formation, state building, or in situations when states are in crisis. So I think if you look at any major historical incidents of genocide, you will always see that there's serious crisis about the state, right? From Rwanda to Balkans to Afghanistan and to other places, when there are serious contestation over state, the direction of the state, or who controls the state. It is during this kind of situations when certain groups are singled out and targeted with mass violence, and in certain situations that can become genocidal in the context of the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So, having the kind of broader background in mind, so, when did the Hazaras become the target of a genocidal campaign? I think it's really important to see that this took place during the reign of Amir Abdurrahman Khan, who, as we know, came to power towards the end of the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which took place from 1780 to 1880. And he came to power as a result of a deal he struck with the envoys of the British India at that time. And that deal really formed the foundation of the rule of Amir Abdurrahman Khan over the following 20 and 21 years of his rule. So what are some of the key features of that rule and how that led to genocide? I think I have provided quite detailed account of that period in a chapter in the book that I published in 2017 that you kindly cited. In that book, I use a number of different factors, and that includes Islam as being used as a central element of state building, centralization of power, and also a policy of dependence on foreign patronage, because throughout those years of his rule, Amir Abdurrahman Khan was heavily dependent on British financial as well as military subsidies that he received over the years. So, during those years, Amir Abdurrahman Khan embarked on a number of wars to bring various regions and communities of what became Afghanistan under his rule. He used again Islam, to create a particular justification, foundation for his rule, for his authority as a king. In his own words, he was like Zillullah, like the shadow of God on earth, right? And he also declared anyone who opposed his rule as rebel, and therefore he had the religious authority to mobilize people against those people. So there's a lot of different kind of details for which we don't have time, but those kind of policies culminated with the Hazara War, or what became known as the Hazara War of 1891 to 1893, which I argue in my book is really a textbook example of genocide in the modern history of Afghanistan. It is, a genocide that is comparable to other, serious, genocidal campaigns of those years. Maybe you can compare it to the Armenian genocide at the end of the First World War in modern Turkey. So, like the genocide of Armenians in Turkey, it is again the time of significant upheaval, crisis, change, and state formation. So Hazaras are singled out as a group who is different, very distinctive, based on their ethnic characteristics, based on their cultural differences, a specific geography, but also religion, and all of those different factors were used to single out the Hazaras. I think, again, we can go into greater detail about some of the proclamations, made by Amir Abdurrahman Khan to justify his, genocide of the Hazaras. All of those, there are quite a lot of those evidence that demonstrate that there was a clear intent to destroy the Hazaras in whole or in part, to use the language of the Genocide Convention. So now, coming back to the question you posed to me, how has the state responded to the history and the legacy and the impact of that genocide on the Hazaras? So I think to answer that question, it's very important to see that the period of Amir Abdurrahman Khan is quite a foundational moment in the history of Afghanistan, because this is the time that a new nation state is born in Afghanistan under those specific circumstances which I outlined, and therefore there are a lot of historical myths and imaginations and legends that are developed around that kind of period. And if you look at all of those major historical accounts, you can see one common thread running through all of those historical narratives. That is that Amir Abdurrahman Khan is generally recognized as someone who was ruthless, who was brutal, who was violent, but his violence and brutality is justified in the name of the creation of a modern state, centralization of power, unification of the country as one nation. So therefore, the genocide of Hazaras, or the killing of Hazaras, mass displacement of Hazaras, are justified because, according to the historical narratives, Hazaras were standing in the way of the formation of a modern nation state in Afghanistan. This is a historical narrative, a historical myth, as I said, because if you look at the historical record of those years, including the period of 1891 to 1893, there is no such evidence to demonstrate that the Hazaras were, willing and committed to oppose any central authority. So I have specifically looked at how, in the first major wars, for example, broke out in Uruzgan. The wars broke out in Uruzgan at that time in spring of 1891. The first major war was not because Hazaras were opposed to any kind of central authority, but because after Amir Abdurrahman Khan's forces arrived in the region and they started looting, pillaging, and raping women in Hazara houses, that the Hazaras started rising against the state. So therefore, there is a kind of narrative. So now, if you look again the kind of genocide studies, I think we have had quite a number of references to the work of Gregory Stanton, where he said that genocide has different kind of phases, right? It goes through various steps once it is completed. According to that kind of account, denial is the final stage of genocide as a process. In all major events of genocide that have taken place in different parts of the world, all of them face a culture of denial, where the perpetrating groups in the general population see, well, we haven't seen or we haven't experienced that kind of genocide. There was a violence with the Hazaras, but that violence was also targeting other groups, including members of the Pashtun ethnic group as well during Amir Abdurrahman Khan's reign. And you can see echo of that kind of historical narrative with regards to the recent genocidal attacks on Hazaras as well. During the 20 years of the Republic, as we see again, is that time when Afghanistan is undergoing a new phase of its state building, state unification, and there is quite a lot of different kind of violence taking place: terrorism, counter-terrorism, insurgency, counter-insurgency, and a lot of those violence are affecting different groups across Afghanistan. But it is during this period that we also see the Hazaras are being targeted simply because of who they are. I think as other speakers, including Professor William Mary, quite elaborately explained that. So when the Hazaras try to raise their voice, claim that this is a genocide and therefore it needs a distinctive response, the common response again was that, well, this is a situation of war and violence, generalized violence. It is affecting everyone. And we have also seen those accounts that been trying to compare numbers, right? How many Hazaras, members as well as members of other ethnic groups are killed in the war and violence in Afghanistan. And obviously, again, that kind of argument is trying to gloss over the fact that the Hazaras are facing a particular type of targeted systematic violence because of who they are, not because of where they are. They could be, for example, in a situation where there is a suicide bombing that also kills a lot of civilians in those kind of contexts. So therefore, I think the general point I would like to make here is again that we see the persistence of that kind of culture of denial and impunity in Afghanistan that continues to refuse that the Hazaras were the victims of a particularly distinctive type of mass atrocity. It is not like war crimes or crimes against humanity, generally speaking, but it is genocide, right? And that is, for a number of different reasons. First, because genocide is so profound that it is challenging the central myths, the central claim, the central historical narratives around the foundation of the modern state in Afghanistan. Therefore, the elites in Afghanistan, different regimes, even during the Republic, are very reluctant to accept any sort of central challenge, a kind of historical narrative from which they draw their authority, their legitimacy, and from which the symbolism of the state is drawn. And therefore, various groups have been trying to downplay, minimize, and try to generalize it. But nonetheless, I think over the past few years, specifically, I think after the start of the Hazara genocide campaign, we have seen, I think, greater awareness among the general people. So you can see, intellectuals, activists from members of other ethnic groups who are often participating in this kind of campaigns to raise awareness with regards to genocidal violence towards the Hazaras. But that has not yet reached a level where it could also change, any significant policy or attitude among the elites in Afghanistan. And I think I will conclude here by making one final point about the Taliban in Afghanistan. The Taliban is also a group that is drawing quite different kind of sources to claim legitimacy. Religious authority is obviously one of them, but it is also a group that I have argued in my research recently that is also drawing on a particular type of historical narrative. And that kind of historical narrative is also one that is exclusionary, that is denying the experience of different groups in Afghanistan, is also, I think, providing foundations for ongoing violence and persecution of the Hazaras and other groups in Afghanistan. So therefore, I think if you see, a recognition of genocide of the Hazaras is not only something in a brave moral intellectual exercise, but it is also one that can challenge the central institutions of the state, especially the informal institutions such as the land relations that have evolved over the decades between the Hazaras in Hazarajat, but on one side, and the Pashtun nomads on the other side. All of those kind of claims, disputes have their roots in the foundation of modern state in Afghanistan in the 19th century. So therefore, a recognition of the genocide takes quite a lot more than just ethical and moral bravery. So I think with that, I would like to stop here. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. We will return to you, Dr. Ibrahimi. Already we have a question for you, but that would be for the Q&A. Thank you for highlighting that, state building and state formation and state crisis, state collapse, which is happening in Afghanistan almost every some years. And then that's during this crisis that genocide happened, and that's quite a grim picture because it is an ongoing process, crisis, and state failures and all. And so that highlights actually for us that that alerts us that there is the possibility of another genocide. And you are emphasis on why Abdul Rahman emphasis on Islam as a state identity, and subsequently other governments have shown that Abdul Rahman did it because it was necessary. So it and all that. Thank you for that. Now we will move to Dr. Abbas Farasoo. Do we have Dr. Abbas Farasoo with us? Dr. Sip? Oh, yes. So
yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Dr. Sip Farasoo, I saw your paper on OIR, and that has some kind of epistemology and philosophy of science to it. That's why I thought to ask this question from you, that how scholarships on Afghanistan, writers, authors, social scientists, and overall the epistemology which used studying Afghanistan's history, politics, and cultures, and issues of ontological significance, how they have approached the question of Hazara genocide and this issue. Thank you, Dr. Mike is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this timely event. It's such an important event to discuss about that when different other issues related to Afghanistan. So this one is, I think, if you want to have justice in Afghanistan and equality and democracy in the future, and also prevent crimes like genocide, this is the key topic to discuss about that. So coming to your question, that's a difficult question, complex question. So let me, before that, just give you a two short introduction. Then I will move to the main question. First, when we're discussing genocide, recently many people look at genocide from the legal perspective, which is the definition come from the Genocide Convention. So that's a legal perspective of genocide that's much more attractive because of it. It's politically important, and also it's from the legal perspective. But sometimes there is other perspective, like sociological perspective, interdisciplinary perspective, historical, and also recently comparative analysis, and also anthropological analysis of genocide. Those other perspectives are very important because they give much more contextual analysis and historical analysis to conceptualize genocide. because evidence that we use for the legal perspective by themselves, most of the times, it's really difficult to interpret those evidence and data. So those evidence and data requires much more contextual analysis to help legal perspectives. But when it comes to a legal perspective, it's much more. Many people actually criticize that because of the minimalist approach. Because originally genocides, we remember Lemkin, is much more focused on social destruction of social pattern and also cultural consequences and the destruction of the social entity or the society of an ethnic group or a religious group. So, but when it comes, it's much more process-oriented analysis. When it comes to legal perspective, it's much more event-oriented. So that's one introduction comes to the talking about genocide. The second short introduction, you are asking me about ontological and epistemological perspective or approach when coming to studying genocide in Afghanistan. First of all, to make these terms clear for our audience, ontology basically refers to how we understand the reality, how we conceptualize a reality, or provide a picture of an equation of about the being or about the reality, how we can understand the reality of genocide in Afghanistan history or the consequences of that aftermath after during Abdurrahman Khan. And the epistemology is basically dealing with the knowledge about knowledge, or the knowledge of knowledge, put in that simple way. That how we transfer knowledge around discussing genocide. So moving back to your question, from my perspective, discussing genocide in Afghanistan is really relatively a new body of scholarship coming out about studying genocide in Afghanistan. Before that, when discussing Afghanistan scholarship, whether it's in English language or in Persian or Dari language, it's not much more conceptualization about atrocities or crime in Afghanistan. It's much more about like Kallamunar and these kinds of terminologies and other terminologies, but it's not much more in the context of mass atrocities and crimes like genocide, things like that. So recently we have three key perspectives when it comes to studying genocide, which is relevant to both ontological understanding of genocide and also the epistemological analysis of genocide. The first one is recently we have a scholarship and research legal perspective, and it's wonderful that we have the next panel, our colleagues that will look at the issue from the legal perspective. And the second perspective is much more like political science or political sociology, and we have Niamat here was discussing about the role of state formation in Afghanistan and its consequences relevant to genocide in Afghanistan. That's considering legal perspective, but it's much more related to political sociology and history and political science. And the third one is, which is much more historical perspective when it comes to understanding genocide, to understand and provide details about historical events. But when it comes to historical perspective, still there's much more room to conceptualize and work and find data and provide significant data about the key events happening in the history. We are dealing with different events when it comes to the war during Abdurrahman Khan, but there's not much evidence. We have Siraj al-Tawarikh, which is one of the key sources, and also other archives, for example, in England, UK, India, and other regional countries. But I think still there's a lot of effort to look at this archive and provide and look at this evidence and bring those evidence in the context of studying genocide of Hazaras in Afghanistan. So we have these three perspectives, but still we need to look at genocide in Afghanistan from other perspectives as well. For example, comparative studies, like other cases at international cases, that what is common with other international cases that already recognized, and there's enough literature about those cases, what is common between those cases and as well as genocide in Afghanistan. So I think there are the areas that need further research and need more works to explore, and it means it will provide sort of comparative studies when it comes to genocide in Afghanistan, or Hazara genocide. Another key issues I think here it's important to highlight is the how we understand and conceptualize the Hazara genocide in Afghanistan. When we're talking about the Hazara genocide, mainly we talk about the historical events, particularly the events during the Abdurrahman Khan war against the Hazaras. I think, as William Milley mentioned, and also other colleagues and Dr. Ibrahimi, it's a typical case of genocide in the modern history of Afghanistan. But how to conceptualize that genocide and how it happens, one of the common view is that state formation, and then how we understand state formation. There's two perspectives. One is, okay, this is parts of state formation in the history and happen every other places as well. So that's some sort of justification to deny the crime. So that's one perspective. The other perspective is much more critical, but it's still in the context of state formation. But there's not much question about the state formation, the concept of state formation, because as recent here, in the literature about state building, it looks like a normative approach talking about state formation. But if you look at the history of Afghanistan, what we call state formation is much more a predatory domination in the history. In some periods of time, it's moving towards much more looking like a state as a Webrian concept. But for most of the times, it's much more a predatory domination, plundering, killing, domination, and producing a circle of supporters and allowing the supporters to go and take people's land and things like that. So that's much more in the context of predatory domination. And this predatory domination has three significant pillars in the history of Afghanistan that contribute to genocide. One is ethnic domination. The second pillar of that is plundering economy. And the third one is religious justification for that. And still with the Taliban, for example, the Taliban regime right now is one of the very typical example, I think the clear example of this sort of domination. In this domination, as William Milley was mentioning, there's no constitution, there's no legal framework, there's no balance of power and accountability. So as Niamat mentioned, if there is any sort of crisis, there's this risk of genocide in the current context of politics in Afghanistan at the moment as well. So that's one of the key dimensions of conceptualizing genocide in Afghanistan, how we understand in the context of basically political organization, political mechanism. And the second one is, which is much more focused on the impacts of genocide, which is the deterritorialization of the Hazaras. In the literature, historically, and most of these documents in Persian and in English, we are talking much more about land was taken from the Hazaras. But this concept of land is somehow different from the deterritorialization of the Hazaras, how they lost their territory, and how gradually from during the from the Ahmad Shah Abdullah in Kandahar after that, since we have some historical evidence, till Abdurrahman Khan and after that. So they gradually lost their territories and facing some sort of deterritorialization and massive displacement during the Abdurrahman Khan. And these are the elements that help us to document and conceptualize the Hazara genocide in Afghanistan. The third key point I would like to highlight here is that we should, I think, one key event is, or events related to genocide, or we can understand that as genocide during the Abdurrahman Khan, and after that the consequences of that event till today. So what happened during Abdurrahman Khan is the clear case of genocide in terms of understanding genocide as event. But after that till today, it's much more like a process. And some scholars in the literature call that a genocidal continuum, or silent genocide. Sometimes the silent genocide refers to massive marginalization and poverty and social destruction and destroying the social patterns with a long history and long consequences throughout the history. And also, after the key events of genocide, there's something happened throughout the decades and centuries, but those events not very frequently, for example, after 2 years, after 1 year, or after 3 years, but still they have genocidal intention. We call the genocidal continuum. I think what we have after Abdurrahman Khan till today and now, and during the attacks by ISIS-K and the first round of the Taliban. So we have this genocidal continuum that the Hazaras face, dealing with that, and are the victims of that. So I think all this complexity around the case of Hazara genocide requires much more diverse approach to understand that. It's not just, of course, legal perspective is very important, but when it comes to conceptualization, comparative studies, even literature on feminism, literature, feminism approach will helps to diversify this study and investigation when it comes to the investigation about the Hazara genocide. And I would like to stop here. If there's any question, I'm happy to.
Thank you, Dr. Farasoo. Of course, there is a question. I have myself one, and we will return to that. And as you ended up with the feminist intersectionality studies, now that's exactly the point to move to Dr. Farkhondeh Akbari. Dr. Farkhondeh Akbari, yes, we have you with us. So in the same process, so now I'm asking a question. The question is, how do gender and ethnicity intersect in Afghanistan? How can the experiences of Hazara women be captured in gender and genocidal studies? Dr. Said, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Seerat, for the very good question. Before I answer, I want to thank the Association of Hazara Voice for Justice and Hazara Students Association for hosting this very conference, which is very, very timely to turn a spotlight when we are under the Taliban to study and look close unknown and the untold genocide of the Hazaras in Afghanistan. Your question looks simple, but I think it's very complex because it gives me different concepts: gender, ethnicity, intersectionality, and so far what I have been hearing, I think the audience very much is aware of the Hazara genocide, but I want to take you to a different journey of this genocide, which is a journey from a woman's lens. Going back, starting from the very beginning, Afghanistan is a patriarchal society who have a very high record of gender-based violence, discrimination of all women in Afghanistan. And this is evident by the current Taliban regime, that there has been over 100 edicts that discriminate against women and girls across Afghanistan, all ethnicities. And it's perhaps one of the most severe regime in the world today that discriminates against a woman. And that's something that international human rights activists and lawyers call a gender apartheid, a term that is being recognized internationally, and there's a lot of debate for it being adopted as a crime against humanity. Having that context in mind of Afghanistan as a place and as a country that gender discrimination is so eminent, and here we talk about an ethnic group that is facing marginalization and discrimination, not only under the Taliban regime, but for over 130 years. And given the history of the Hazara persecution, all discrimination, and in a very hierarchical, patriarchal society like Afghanistan, that we already know that there are deep gender discrimination, but Hazara women, a community that have been facing genocidal crimes against them, what is happening to the women of that community? We heard very less about this experience, this lens, that what are every angle that we look into about humanitarian aid, political participation, every woman. And so far, we know that the diverse identity markers that it affects Hazara people and a Hazara woman are facing them double. the double cap or the double layers of discrimination, or subject to different level of violence. A Hazara woman, and it's not experienced by anyone else in Afghanistan. The women are being discriminated, the Hazara people are being discriminated. But what is discriminated against the Hazara woman is something else. And so far in our discussion, we have been talking about that on state, the Taliban, perpetuation of violence. We do know that our perpetrators have a ethnic ideology, but they also have a gender ideology, right? And where is Hazara woman standing? Hazara woman stands in the intersection of both of double-edged discrimination. I want to take you into a couple of definitions, like a couple we could study in the genocide studies, in intersectionality studies, so that we could really understand. As a girl from Hazara community, and also as a woman scholar from the Hazara community, I feel like there's a lack of knowledge about the experience of Hazara women and how genocide differs from what my brother and my father would face than what I and my mother would face. And here I want to say that the genocide is differently, and perpetrators targets the community or the vulnerable group differently based on their gender, right? And this is what Dr. Ibrahimi mentioned, that there has been rapes, slavery of Hazara women before, which is very understudied area. But this is this is something that we need within the Hazara genocide, which is already not being studied, or there's a lack of study. And there's this Hazara woman who have experienced this whole process of genocide for 130 years under different Afghan regimes differently. And I will take you to understand the concept. I think this is my magic stick for us to understand what is Hazara woman facing. In the household of the Hazara, we are all under the same roof, but you bring the man and the brother and the son, and then the daughter and the mother and the grandmother. The experience is different. We as a community have not acknowledged that. We have addressed that. And us to sort of get into a point that we accept and we learn about, also apply this to our own. And recently I have been exposed to the concept of intersectionality, which I thought that really captured the experience of Hazara women. It's a framework that help us to appreciate the complexities of identity and politics in the context that is marked not only by gender, but also by ethnicities, sectarian divisions, I don't know, sect, religious, and whatever. And intersectionality, this whole concept, I think, boiling it down to sort of understand the experience of Hazara women in genocide and in gender apartheid, is a framework that examines how various social groups, political identities, race, gender, and sexuality intersects uniquely between one another, that puts one in a privileged position than another. And intersectionality, we know, was developed by an African-American scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, in 1989, and she also built this concept from other Black feminists in the US who have been through various degrees of discrimination, but she that concept and international recognition that women who face marginalization in their community and based on ethnicity, but also in the general politics, puts them in a very vulnerable position. That into the Hazara community, I think Intersect only captures the experience of a woman in Afghanistan who is a Hazara. Every woman in Afghanistan has faced discrimination, gender-based violence and discrimination, but only through a lens of intersectionality, what the experience of Hazara women is like, a community that is facing genocidal crimes. And I'm going over time, but I want to quickly talk to you about the experience of Hazara women and why this lens is so important for us to understand what our mothers, what our daughters and our sisters have been going through in the last 140 years of genocide. If today the Hazara genocide is an unrecognized crime and untold stories, and it is so difficult for us sort of to codify it internationally as a crime and tell our experience. But you know what? The story of Hazara women is even more difficult. It is not captured in the limited studies of Hazara genocide. The study of Hazara genocide is less than the fingers I have in my hand, right? And the references that these studies make to the woman's experience is even less. And this makes it even more difficult for our women who have been so active in the community culturally, politically, and religiously. And in the last 20 years has been evident of that political and social participation of Hazara women, the sacrifice that they have been making, and the fact that there is no lens, there is no framing that could capture their experience. I have been studying the gender politics in Afghanistan in the last 20 years, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, the National Action Plans. I do not see a single project in Afghanistan in the last 20 years that capture the experience of a marginalized and a persecuted group of women like Hazaras. But we do know from our own community, from our lived experiences, and from the stories that we have been told, that the sacrifices that our women have been giving in their household. You mentioned that women were like the highest voters in Daikundi, or the highest higher education participants in concours and whatever, and the social movements that we have, Junbish Roshnai, Tabassum, and the participation of women. But even in our own community, we do not have any study or any kind of recognition of what the Hazara women have been going through and to capture their experiences. Coming forward today under the Taliban rule, January 2024, the Taliban had a crackdown in Dasht Barchi, and they captured Hazara girls and women. To demoralize the community, we already know the way that the narrative of Hazara women being the participants of democracy have been used to justify the killings of infants and mothers in MSF hospitals, the 200 plus schoolgirls who were killed in Saidul Shahada, and the many other educational centers that primarily targeted Hazara girls. Our perpetrators have a gender dimension, but we as a community, and neither the international community, have so far understood the gender dimension of this aspect. Every other genocides have a gender studies done about them. Rwanda has, the Yazidis has, and Armenian has, just to look at genocide from a gender perspective. But from the Hazaras, we do not have this. And this is where I urge first to my own community and scholars from my community and activists from my community, please listen what a Hazara activist and a Hazara woman has to say to you. Especially now that we are in a gender apartheid Afghanistan, And we have a very active Hazara civil society in the ground. And we also have these different vulnerabilities that our women and girls are going through. And I think this is where that I can I'll make it short to make the call for what could be done. My critique of the gender apartheid campaigns, it does not have an intersectional lens. Like all the gender projects in Afghanistan, it does not capture the experience of Hazara women. And for gender apartheid campaign to be successful, you need to listen and hear the Hazara community. And the Stop Hazara Genocide campaign, from my community, it also does not have a gender aspect to it. And for it to succeed, it needs to have that lens to listen to the women, and the women are the leaders of these campaigns. There needs to be a solidarity between gender apartheid and Hazara Genocide campaign. And this is where Hazara women can play a very active role. And I will end here. I'm sorry if I have gone over time.
Thank you, Dr. Akbari. You mentioned this concept of introducing intersectionality in Afghanistan scholarship and also activism and campaigns is very important, because what I heard from Hazara girls which were detained by the Taliban post 2021, all of them are saying in the prison. So other girls were used, abused. They were told bad words by the Taliban, but ethnic slurs were specifically used by the Taliban toward the Hazara girls. Which I cannot repeat it. So that aspect is there, which is neglected. And thank you for bringing it up. And hopefully, other scholars and activists pick it up. And so now we move to Bismellah Alizada. We have been focusing on Afghanistan and Hazaras and Hazara Jod. And past, distance past. Now we are coming a little timely close to us, and also moving out of Afghanistan and to Quetta, Pakistan. Alizada has worked with my Samuel Tauf on a report that details painstakingly the experiences and genocides of the Hazaras in Pakistan. So, Alizada, please, mic is yours, and yeah.
Thank you so much. So far, so much is covered in terms of this 130 years of systematic violence against Hazaras by the Afghan state and also by non-state actors. I think one of the things that's very important to highlight before I start is the fact that Afghan state is mostly associated with discontinuities, but sadly, violence against Hazaras is one of those continuities in the past 130 years time, and that's extremely sad. But now it's also important to break it down. We've had different phases of these systematic attacks against Hazaras. The 1890s phase, and then we have the phase from 1900s up until 1978. We have the 1980s, we have the 1990s, and we have the post-2002. Now, for the sake of time, I will try to focus on the period post-2002 because that phase is actually not discussed that much in today's conversation. Well, one thing that's important is, unfortunately, the violence against Hazaras is understudied. Other speakers have also alluded to this, and I echo that it's understudied. It's generally understudied, both in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So there is a need for us to generate an evidence base, to collect the testimonials and to collect the stories of the victims of genocide and victims of mass atrocities, Hazaras being one of them, and then to create a knowledge base to be able to understand it with all of its nuances, and to be able to, to rehumanize all of these atrocities, to give it a human face, and to bring to life those experiences. Because, what has happened to the Hazaras and what has happened to any victims of crimes like crimes against humanities and genocide is more than those stories. It's more than those numbers, and it's more than those attacks, those number of attacks. Now, in media and in some of the studies, we tend to focus so much on how many attacks have happened over what period of time and how many people have been killed or wounded. But I think it's extremely important to focus on that human aspect of it, to rehumanize it, and to bring, to bring out those those human stories in this process. I will echo Dr. Farasoo's caution that we should not sort of reduce our efforts in the discussions on Hazara genocide to international law perspective or to the international law field. That is very important, of course, and so far we've had a lot of focus on that, not only today but generally. I mean, for the past years that we've spoken generally about the Hazara genocide, we've tried to focus it so much on that international law lens. And within that international law lens, of course, we've tried to, to narrow it down to the definition of genocide as reflected and codified within the 1948 convention, Article 2 of that convention, and then Article 6 of the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Those are important, but echoing what Dr. Farasoo also said, it's important to understand the nuances, to understand all of the other mostly ignored aspect of this experience of genocide. So that would mean, using a lot of other disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approaches, using art, for instance, to express what has happened to the Hazaras, and using all sorts of other disciplinary approaches that Dr. Farasoo talked about. Now, with that, I will try to focus on a few key questions and try to explain, post 2002, what has happened to the Hazaras and the implications of that, and so on. And then I'll try to explain what sort of data we have to answer those questions. Well, the first question is, which is extremely important, of course, is what sort of violence has happened to the Hazaras, or what sort of violence have Hazaras been subjected to post 2002 in Afghanistan. Now, we do not have a lot of documentations and a lot of investigations. In the 1990s, we have a few documentations and reports and investigations by institutions like Human Rights Watch, by, for example, the Afghan Justice Project. There is a UN mapping report written by Barnett Rubin and Patricia Grossman, I think. And there was another independent report that was conducted by the Independent Human Rights Commission, Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, which is not published. So those are, like, the sort of reports and evidence that we have for the crimes that have happened during the 1990s mostly. But post 2002, unfortunately, no such thing has been conducted and has been done. So there is less of the evidence. Now, we have independent researchers and some people from within the academia and some media organizations who've tried to identify and document and record some of these attacks that have happened post-2002. The general narrative is that the Hazaras have benefited more than any other ethnic group. It's quote unquote a narrative in post-2002. But unfortunately, in post-2002, Hazaras have been one of those ethnic groups that have endured, these mostly ignored and mostly stifled systematic violence. In one of the researches that we undertook, which is unfortunately not completed and not published, we identified, Rustam, you're with us in doing that. We identified as many as 294 incidents between 2002 and June 2022. So over the span of 20 years, we have identified 294 incidents of violence against Hazaras. Out of those, we have tried to detail 266 of them. And then our findings show that 2,228 people have been killed. Of course, this number is underreported mostly, and the records about casualties is not always accurate. 2,873 more people have been wounded. This is sort of the casualty that Hazaras have endured in the past, mostly in the past 2 decades, which some people say the golden time for the Hazaras under the mostly Republican order. Now, these attacks, they've been Kuchi attacks, for example, beginning from 2004 and 5. Dr. Farasoo has also worked on that for a few years on the Kuchi attacks against the Hazaras. I have tried to explain it recently in a detailed report that was published in Ittalaat Rose. This is like a sort of violence that is sanctioned by the state, and it has led to killing of Hazaras, displacement. Many people have been maimed and wounded, and people's homes and properties have been destroyed and ruined, and people's lives have been ruined by this. So the Kuchi attack is one trend in the past 2 decades. We've also had attacks by the Taliban, particularly beginning from 2010. It intensified over the years up until the collapse of the previous regime and the ascendance of Taliban to power. And since 2021, of course, it has deteriorated. Another group that in some cases was involved in attacking the Hazaras was Hikmat Yar's group back in the days. And then beginning from 2014, unfortunately, this new and very opaque group, which is ISKP, has been very active and has been taking responsibility for most of the attacks against Hazaras. And it's important to focus on the fact that all of these attacks have been against, the ones that we've recorded, against civilian populations. Say, like all sorts of civilian populations. People at schools, students, commuters, people in demonstrations, babies, mothers giving birth, and all of that. And we know those details. Now, for the sake of time, I'll be short here. But another question that's important here is which groups have perpetrated these acts of violence against Hazaras? Now, we need a lot of research on this. This is also a question, that hasn't been really taken very seriously. And in the literature, we do not have a lot of evidence, a lot of literature generally on this. But one thing that's important is we have had the state as an actor, or the state actors, and we had non-state actors. The state actors, the Afghan state, in many ways have been complicit and if not perpetrator, it has been complicit. It's been facilitating the general situation in which all of these atrocities against Hazaras have taken place. Now, the state actors and the non-state actors, they've also found sort of this commonality, in which the state either ignored the violence against Hazaras by non-state actors or in some cases facilitated it. The Kuchi attacks against the Hazaras, in so many cases, it's documented by many people, has been supported by the state. The state has in many cases provided cover, provided support, and all of that. And the Taliban and the Kuchis, they have intersected, they've collaborated in the attacks against Hazaras. Now you see that, a range of actors, state actors and non-state actors, they sort of collaborate. They've collaborated. There are instances of them collaborating. Sometimes they've done it independently, of course. But if we think of the state as the more like, as the bigger player, sort of bearing the responsibility of protecting civilian populations. Now, relinquishing that responsibility in one or the other way indirectly is also contributing to it. So the state in Afghanistan, the central state, has been complicit in that sense. Now, why are those actors perpetrating these acts of violence against the Hazaras? This is also the million-dollar question. Now, in research so far, we know that two things is extremely key in this process. One is the ethnic identity of the victims, which is the Hazaras, and one is the religious identity of the victims, as the Hazaras. Now we can do a lot of research on this, and then we can, try to explain it in a much more comprehensive manner. But ethnic and religious identities is key here. The Hazaras have been targeted because of their physical, the facial, for example, appearance, because of their affiliation with a particular faith and religious practice, because they belong to a particular province, and generally their identity. Now, they've been subjected to persecution by the state as well because of their ethnic and religious identity, and sort of by non-state actors, as I already explained. Now, what makes this possible? What makes it? What sort of like makes this general situation possible for these things to happen? One thing that's very key here, I think, and again, I should emphasize that this needs a lot of research. All of these questions are under research, and we do not have a lot of evidence. So there is a need for further research. But one thing that's important to focus here is hate and hateful othering. There's this two traditions of othering in the history of Afghanistan in the past decade or so, in the past century or so, sorry. One is this, Afghanistan's the Afghanistan's encounter with modernity and the birth of this nationalistic sort of narratives beginning in the early 2 decades of the 20th century. Now, according to that, Hazaras are othered as foreign or non-original dwellers of this land, for instance. Now, we can go on and on about how that was, but I'll try to focus on the other one now for the sake of time. But we understand so far from historical sources and from literature that was inspired by, for example, the Aryanism and the Nazism. So it was going around that line, and the othering was sort of going around, along that line. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, we have a different othering coming from more fundamentalist religious trends in Afghanistan at the time during the Mujahideen. Now, what we see within the Taliban right now is those two trends coming together. Taliban is a manifestation of the ethnic othering, which was the first trend, the first tradition, and then the religious othering. And the Hazaras have been sort of, subjected to this sort of like dual othering. This is, I think, extremely important to focus here. Now, under the Taliban, it's increasing. I've recently explained it in another piece that was also published in Itilat, that how Taliban think of themselves as, having this mission of converting Hazaras to proper Muslims, and they've explained this in so many cases that they've talked about this publicly. So there has been this discourse, to cut it short, of constructing Shia Hazaras as worthy of killing, impure, and to construct them intrinsically as a threat to that us, the other, which is the Hazaras, and the us, which is Afghans, quote unquote. Now, Hazaras have been, said to be puppets of Iran and all sorts of other labeling to project them as threats to the national identity in Afghanistan, or to the nation in Afghanistan, quote unquote nation. Now, within the Taliban regime, of course, the two intersect. At the same time, there is a proliferation of terrorist groups and radical Islam in Afghanistan. It has been there since the time of jihad in the 1980s, and under the Taliban recently, this has worsened. We have reports from the international organizations, including the United Nations Security Council, that groups like Al-Qaeda and many other groups, the terrorist groups, including the ISKP.
Alizada said within 1 minute, please.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure. I'll try.
Yeah, the organizers are reminding me that, that we have. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. So these groups, are growing in strength and in number and capacity in Afghanistan. Marginality of the Hazaras and lack of a political will from the Afghan state to protect the Hazaras is another one. Impunity and the costlessness of attacks against Hazaras is another factor. And also there's also this political economy dimensions that was also mentioned before in the panel. Now, how can we understand this? If I can cover this very briefly, we've tried to understand it using the lens of international law, as crimes against humanity or as genocide. But I think, as Dr. Farasoo also said, it's important for us to go beyond that. And it's a very limited sort of perspective. We need to go beyond that. We need to rehumanize the stories. We need to use many of the theoretical tools that we have within academia, particularly within the all of the critical and leftist sort of theories, to be able to explain these atrocities and to understand them in a much deeper way. Now, I'll stop here and and take questions later.
Okay, thank you, Alizada said. You actually answered one of our questions also, which was asked by Rahila Raha, why the Hazaras are getting killed, or despite them being hardworking and calm and all. So that's the question was answered already. So we have question to Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi. So I will go in the order of the question which we have received. Dr. Ibrahimi, the Muhammad Ali Irfan has asked that how did the Afghan government's actions contribute to the conceptualization of the Hazara genocide, and what were the key failures that enabled this atrocity to occur? What future direction could be taken to prevent such events? And also maybe, I will ask another question by Yasin Samin. Is there historical evidence of Afghan government admitting to genocide? What should Hazara elites, intellectuals, and activists should do to make this is recognized, to make sure it is recognized in a future democratically elected, if our hope is true? Dr. Ibrahimi.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'll be brief. I believe we are a little bit over time with our panel, so I wouldn't steal much of a time from the second panel. Well, to the question raised by Mr. Irfan, I think the state in Afghanistan, or the ruling regimes, to be more specific, haven't done any work specifically to conceptualize Hazara genocide. And their work, as I mentioned in my presentation, was that to deny genocide. There's no such a thing as genocide, to the extent that Afghan state has recognized anything happening in Afghan is a set of generalized violence which was necessary for the birth of a state. In that kind of narrative, the people like Hazaras are becoming a kind of sacrificial lamb, that can be sacrificed, that can be painful, but it is necessary for the birth of a modern state. So that is the kind of myth narrative that I mentioned. But how they have been justifying, I think, again, just coming back to the question, I think also Dr. Farasoo touched on, is this whole idea of contrasting the state with the non-state actors, so groups who are outside the state. The state is seen as a vehicle for civilization, modernization, order, progress, stability, and groups who are outside the state structure, domain of the state, they are seen as backward feudal people, who are not ready to embrace progress and civilization, and therefore there is a certain amount of force necessary to bring those people from their backwardness into a state of progress and modernity. So this is, I think the language that Amir Abdurrahman Khan used, I think in a way, which is also similar to the Taliban now. People who opposes the Taliban authority or Amir Abdurrahman Khan's authority, they use religious justification to denounce them as Yaghi or Baghi, right? Rebels, which has, it's not like just a rebel, right? It is in the Islamic tradition, Yaghi or Bagawat is a crime, and people who engage in that kind of crime can be subject to very severe punishment. So now, I think coming back to the question raised by Mr. Samim, what has the state done anything, and what can be done to progress that kind of cause in a future, an open and democratic state in Afghanistan? I think the key thing to note is general historiography in Afghanistan has been mostly silent with regards to the situation of Hazaras, the genocide specifically. There was one time I was in Kabul looking at the history textbooks taught to students at high schools during different regimes. What I found was quite interesting. Until the end of the monarchy, again, it was the same story. It was no mention of the genocide, the killing of Hazaras. Amir Abdurrahman Khan brought the state control, all of those things, it was necessary. There was some feudal law supporting it, again, it had to be crushed, right? But it was during the period of the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, after 1978 and 79, that we see certain changes in the historical narrative that are being taught to students in school textbooks. As we know, the PDPA was a socialist kind of political party, which was very much opposed to the monarchies that came before it, right? So therefore, they had a kind of historical interest in revising, introducing kind of more revisionist history. And there we can see this kind of references to like the Khalqi, Zahmatkashi Hazara, the hardworking people of Hazara who were massacred by Amir Abdurrahman Khan. But it didn't go as far as recognizing genocide. I think, probably that was a bit too far as a step for them to take. But I think it was some kind of opening during those periods. And we also see that with that kind of new historical narrative, we also saw greater appointment of Hazara leaders in positions of authority in the government in Kabul, most prominently, Kishman as Prime Minister of PDP during the 1990s. So therefore, I think looking forward, I'll be very brief and just echo what Mr. Hazara said. I think we need a lot more work to do in terms of research, in terms of writing, and also drawing on different mediums of communication, not just writing, but also people who are engaged in art, artistic endeavors, learning from other situations. I think Holocaust story is told and documented by a great many intellectuals, lawyers, publicists who wrote a lot about that period. But also we see that the narrative and the documentation also produced by films, right? By music, by art, and really extensive memorialization that brings all of the very different kind of perspectives to that situation. And finally, I think it is also important, to progress that kind of message that I think has been so far very central to the Stop Hazara Genocide campaign, is that this is not some kind of competition over sort of victimization, right? I think while we recognize the violence and other kinds of crimes that are perpetrated against other groups in Afghanistan, we should, I think, continue to make the case that this is a distinctive subcategory of political violence or crimes. That doesn't mean that others haven't suffered in a different way. So I think that would be my general message. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahimi. We have two questions which have been posed to both Dr. Ibrahimi and Dr. Abbas Farasoo. So we will think that Dr. Farasoo's answer will be suffice for that. So Dr. Farasoo, there's one question that why there has been such limited international media coverage and response to the Hazara genocide, and how can we improve global awareness? The second question by Ramin Azar is, what is the right approach to address tribal and ethnic dominance in Afghanistan, as it will cost you your social network of friends in Pashtun community and build a sense of mistrust between you and them, or they just accuse you of discrimination? Please share your experience and thought on that. Yeah, it's a very how to approach this talking genocide with our with other members of other ethnic groups. Dr. Farasoo. Just a reminder that the organizers are reminding that please be brief in your response.
Okay, I will start from the first question. If I forget the second one, please remind me. Okay, from the first one, first we were talking about the Hazara genocide from the Abdurrahman Khan's time. And that time, international community and international politics was totally different from today. And Afghanistan was a buffer state between the Russia at that time and British and South Asia. So Afghanistan was a buffer state, and British at that time supported Abdurrahman Khan to control Afghanistan. It was important to control Afghanistan by one strong man, the Iron Emir. So that was much more the international politics and international norms, and human rights or humanitarian law was not the case that we have today. So that was the situation was different at that time. But talking about atrocities against the Hazaras today, it's again depends on international politics, how much Afghanistan is in the focus of international politics. After the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, Afghanistan is not much in the focus of international politics, of big powers, and those who really influence the dynamics of international politics. But at the same time, today, the situation is a little bit different, much more different today. Today we have educated people, media, and international and different platforms for communication and discussions. So there's opportunities to talk about mass atrocities and focus on these issues. I think the new generation and platforms like this are very important to really provide awareness and discuss these issues at the international level, and also ourselves and within the Afghan audience. Coming back to your second question, yet how it's difficult to talk about mass atrocities and Hazara genocide within Afghanistan. If you talk about this topic, some of our friends from non-Hazara friends, especially from other communities like Pashtun friends, they will get upset, things like that. That's the problem, I think. When we're talking about violence, mass atrocities, and human rights, I think it's not something to compromise with friendship or things like that. It's much more big issues and big causes that everyone have to be logical about that and also frank about that. We're talking about human rights and mass atrocities. If you're not talking about mass atrocities and crimes like genocide in Afghanistan, so there's always will be the culture of impunity. And basically, it allows the future, allows different actors to do the same thing in the future if you're not talking about that. So I think, yes, it's costly, it's difficult, sometimes it's sensitive to talk about Hazara genocide or other crimes happening in Afghanistan. Some people quickly ethnicize that, take that as kinds of ethnic discussion and not connecting with that and blaming people for like kinds of ethnocentric politics. I know that, but there's obstacles. It's not easy, but I think when it comes to human rights, values, it's not just belong to the Hazaras, it's belong to everyone in Afghanistan. If everyone wants to have a peaceful and a multicultural, harmonious society in Afghanistan, we have to talk about these hard issues. And friendship is much more like smaller individual circles. But when we're talking about issues like human rights and mass atrocities, which is related to the whole people and the whole Afghanistan, and specifically the Hazara, the community suffered for over a century, I think everyone should be frankly discuss this issue, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Farasoo. There is a question for Dr. Akbari. Dr. Akbari has seen the question, but I read it for our audience. The question is from Hadi Miran. Long-term dehumanization is another outcome of the Hazara genocide. Have you ever encountered the impact of the humanization of the Hazara woman? Dr. Akbari.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I think I had an internet issue before. I'm so sorry. There was some breakout. I won't turn my video on, so I have a clear voice. Thank you, Miran Saib, for the very good question. I think Hazaras being dehumanized throughout the genocidal process, and here we talk about the Hazara woman. I think from every analysis that I have been having about gender in Afghanistan and my encounter towards Hazara women, the dehumanization and also sexualization of Hazara women have been popping out throughout the analysis. And that means that frame is being used as a way to degrade us because of Hazara women have been playing a very active role in the community politically and socially, and this has been something to discriminate us even more. And the men from our own community and people from our own community have also been adopting to that from time to time, to marginalized and putting their patriarchal hats. So I totally endorse, and this is where I want to ask everyone to like listen to the very experience and stories of what every girl from the Hazara community have to tell you. Yes, we had very large participation of Hazara women in the democratization process, political and social and civil society participation, but that came to a cost, and that cost was that we have been dehumanized and in a patriarchal society about who we are. And this is exactly what the Taliban have been answering in January this year, and the detention of the Hazara woman in Dasht-e-Bachi and so on, and also listening to Hazara protesters, the accounts that they have been telling us about their experience in their detention, that how the gender and also the ethnicity is playing a role. Just because we were open culturally and we have been participating, and it has become a layer of our vulnerability. I know we are out of time. I will stop here, but definitely it has been a layer of dehumanization for Hazara women.
Thank you, Dr. Akbari. There is not a specific question to Bismellah Alizada, but we give you 1.5 minutes to Alizada if you have final remark, and then we close the panel.
Well, yeah, I'll be very quick. I think, you know, hand in hand with the political crisis that the Afghan state has faced over the 130 years, it has also faced, I mean, the Afghan state and also the people in Afghanistan collectively. We've all also faced sort of a moral crisis. So our political crisis has been sort of in conjunction with a moral crisis. And I think in order for us to be able to move out of this, there is a need for moral courage and there is a need for moral rectitude. That's important. I think we need to focus on that in our discussions around Hazara genocide and more of the you know, the other atrocities that have happened in Afghanistan over the past 40+ years. Other ethnic groups, you know, the Sikhs and the Hindus and others in Afghanistan who have also been subjected to violence and discrimination and persecution. Because just in one sentence, because I think you know, addressing Hazara genocide will only be possible if we address all of the atrocities in Afghanistan within the framework of, for example, transitional justice or restorative justice or something like that. Addressing Hazara genocide in isolation from all of the other atrocities in Afghanistan, that would be extremely difficult yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Alizada Sahib. We have to acknowledge there is one comment from Yasin Samim that unfortunately we do not have in our panel from other non-12 such as Ismailis and Sunni Hazaras with us, and that's a problem that we should correct it in the future. So I think we had a very good panel, and thank you to all of our panelists, and especially to our panelists from Australia, which is past midnight. Thank you for joining us and for your insights. And also thank you for the audience for listening and for your questions. I sign off and this will give the podium to the next panel. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rustam Ali, Seerat, and all panelists for such an engaging discussion. We really appreciate your work and your insights.